Are electric cars just disposable rubbish? It's something that's said quite a lot in various comments, whether it be on my videos or on news articles or basically most places EVs being discussed online. People will pipe up with, oh, these electric cars are just disposable rubbish. They're not built to last, and you'll be scrapping them by the time they're 3 years old, 5 years old. Delete as appropriate. These claims are normally just shrugged off and dismissed as the rantings of an idiot. At the end of the day, most modern EVs come with long battery warranties, 8 years and 100,000 miles being sort of typical, and very little attention is paid to people that are saying, oh, you'll be scrapping it after a couple of years, you'll be scrapping it after 3 years, they'll barely last, all that stuff, because let's be honest, there just isn't that much truth in it. However, it's quite a difficult thing to prove. It's quite easy to say, well, the manufacturers will stand behind the warranty for a long period of time, therefore they must have confidence. But is there actually any data we can use to back that up? And can we actually prove whether or not EVs are or are not as long lasting as their petrol or diesel equivalents? Well, you may have heard of a website called How Many Left. It uses DVLA registration data to show you, as the name suggests, how many of a given make or model are still on the road. It's often used by classic car enthusiasts, so they can be saying like, oh, I have the one of 3 of these that are left on the road in this exact spec, and people get really excited about that kind of thing if they think they've got something that's really, really rare. And that is mostly what How Many Left's data tends to be used for. I've used it before myself to show that how many Citroen Amis are on the road, for example. So for people are interested in how many of a certain model actually sold, it can also be quite useful for that. But I also think it can be used to look at how some EV models are faring up and how that might well compare to a petrol or diesel car. So I've done this for a few different models, and I'll put the screenshots from How Many Left up on the screen so you can see, but obviously you can go and look them up yourself as well. And basically, it will log for a given make and model exactly as it appears on the registration document, how many are currently taxed, how many are SORNed, and you can also see how many were registered in a given year. So let's start then with the BMW i3. Very popular EV, own one myself, and it is one that was around in 2014, because we were swamped with EV models now, but there weren't actually that many out there if you wanted to buy an EV in 2014, so we were a little bit restricted in what we can look at. But the BMW i3 was a solid choice that was just starting to appear on the market then. 551 i3s, and that is just the one that is registered as BMW i3, so that's not the range extender model, that's the normal, just battery only model. 551 of those were registered in 2014. Today, or based on the most up-to-date stats that How Many Left have, there's a little bit of a lag in them getting the data from DVLA, usually around a quarter or so. 456 of those are taxed and on the road, 14 are SORN. So that means a few have disappeared and are no longer registered. Now, a car will be no longer registered for a couple of reasons, generally. Either it was written off by an insurance company and scrapped because the damage was too great for it to return to the road. Normally, if you get things that are like a Cat B write-off, etc., they're stripped for parts and then they're scrapped. Or it was uneconomical to repair, and so somebody scrapped it. You know, it suffered a mechanical or electrical failure, and it was sent to a scrapyard for that reason, and therefore it is no longer registered and no longer on the road. It used to be a little bit muddier than that, so when you start looking at much older cars, a lot of cars were never actually properly scrapped, and therefore they stay sort of on the system and tend to show up as either SORN or untaxed, because they were never actually issued with a certificate of destruction and removed from the DVLA registers. But today, it is much, much more likely that a scrapped car will just not appear as a registered car, because they're a lot more strict these days on issuing a certificate of destruction and actually removing it from the register. So 85.2% of BMW i3s that were registered in 2014 are still registered today. And 82.7% of those are taxed, and therefore it's fair to say they are still on the road. The ones that are SORN, I think we can say could have something wrong with them, and that's why they're laid up and they're SORN and they're not on the road. But the ones that are taxed, it's very, very likely they are still driving around. The Tesla Model S, another popular EV model that burst onto the scene in 2014. 719 of those were registered in 2014. 607 of them are taxed and 11 are SORN. So 85.9% of them are still registered and 84.4% of them are still on the road. And then we take a look at the Zoe, another really common EV model that you would find in 2014. Alongside the Leaf, it was probably one of the sort of best selling in terms of volume. There's quite a lot of different Zoe models in terms of trim levels and all that stuff, and this is where how many left gets a little bit complicated, because every one of those has its own entry on the database, because that's what it says on the V5. But the most common Zoe is the Dynamic Intense Auto, is what it says on the V5, and 840 of those were registered in 2014. Today, 709 of them are taxed and 24 are SORNed. That means 87.2% of those are still registered and 84.4% of them are still taxed and on the road. Exactly the same percentage of taxed and on the road as the Tesla Model S, which is quite interesting when you consider the difference in price. Now, everyone's favourite EV, the Nissan Leaf, is a little bit of an outlier. 2,300 Nissan Leaf Ascenta were registered in 2014, and that is down to 1,600 taxed and 57 SORN. So 72% of them are still registered and 69.5% of them are still actively on the road. That is a bigger drop, and so we've got the i3 and the Tesla Model S and the Zoe, all very, very similar in how many are still on the road, whereas the Leaf, I would say, is a little bit of an outlier, and we've seen a sharp drop in those, suggesting more Leafs are scrapped. Now, do they cost more to repair if they're crashed, or more likely, are they suffering from battery issues with them having the weaker battery chemistry and the sort of lack of cooling and stuff that the early Leafs have? Well, all Leafs have a lack of cooling, but the earlier ones obviously much more susceptible to degradation and more likely to have been scrapped because people don't want to live with them anymore. And also, see, there is a decent amount of scrap value and even a degraded battery, therefore it could be economically not viable to keep going with it. But I am quite surprised that the Leaf represents quite a big drop versus those other three. So now, those numbers are all well and good. We reckon, on average, 85% of 2014 registered EVs are still on the road, if we think about the i3, the Tesla Model S, and the Zoe. But the Leaf is definitely a little bit of an outlier. But none of this really means anything unless we compare to internal combustion cars. Now, comparing these is easier said than done, because, as I said, the entries and how many left are based on the exact make, model, and sort of full model name that is registered when you look at your V5. And if you look up something like a Ford Focus, which obviously has been around for a long, long time, has many, many, many different model variations and special editions and all that stuff. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of entries for them. Same with the Vauxhall Astra, same with other sort of common volume internal combustion cars. There's absolutely loads of them. One day we'll be in the same position with EVs, but it took a bit more searching to find ones where I could see a considerable number of them were registered in 2014, because that is what we're comparing. But we did manage to do that. So the Nissan Qashqai Ascenta DCI, probably at the time a reasonable alternative to the Leaf if you're in a Nissan dealership. 1,900 of those were registered in 2014, and 1,600 of those are still taxed with 16 SORN. That means that 85% of them are still registered and 84.2% of them are still actively taxed and on the road. And that sounds very familiar. And over with the Ford Focus, 8,900 Ford Focus Z-Tech TDCI were registered in 2014. 7,400 of them are still taxed and 198 are SORN. Yep, you guessed it. 85.3% of them are still registered and 83.1% of them are still actively taxed and being used on the road. So, Nissan Qashqai diesel, Ford Focus diesel, okay, that's only 2 trim levels, but there'll be no reason why a Qashqai Ascenta would be scrapped more often than another model. or a Ford Focus Zetec TDCi would be more likely to be on the road than an equivalent Focus with a different trim level. So I think that is a fair comparison. And they're broadly the same as the i3, the Tesla Model S, and the Renault Zoe. Roughly 85% of them are still on the road. And therefore, apart from the Leaf, which I think the shortcomings of the Nissan Leaf are well known and well understood, there is no direct link between a car being an EV and being less likely to still be on the road after 10 years. So I think you need to look a bit closer. When people say they're just disposable and they'll never last and you'll be scrapping them after 5 years and all this stuff, there is just no proof of that. We've seen 3 out of 4 models that were commonly available in 2014 are still on the road at the same rate as 2 very common diesel cars. Therefore, there is no correlation between it being an EV and it being more likely to be scrapped due to mechanical failure. The vast majority of stuff being sold today, brand new in 2024, has significantly different battery management and cooling and all that stuff that the Leaf didn't have at the time. So therefore, if you're saying today you shouldn't buy a brand new EV because it will be scrapped after 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, then even looking at 2014's cars versus today suggests that that is not correct and that it's no more likely to suffer an early end than any other car. 15% roughly of the Focus diesels and the Qashqai diesels that we're looking at here are scrapped and they're no longer registered. And that, again, will be accident damage, but it will also be gross mechanical failure. You know, if a 7, 8, 9-year-old car suffers catastrophic engine failure, well, not everyone's going to bodge in a second-hand engine from a scrap car and all that. They're going to get the massive repair quote from the dealer to actually fix it properly and say, sod it, scrap it, I'll buy something else. And I have no reason to believe that that's happening more or less often with EVs. And actually, what you might find with modern battery chemistry, where they're properly thermally managed and all that stuff, the degradation is so slow that they might actually keep going for longer because they're less likely to suffer the sort of serious failure. What I think we might see right off older EVs is like power electronic failures and stuff like that. And then there was a story recently about someone with a Zoe that had been quoted a massive bill by Renault to fix it, and they were struggling to find an independent to look at it. And that kind of thing might well be a problem. But the independent repairers are gearing up to fix these things. Cleveland, for example, can fix this problem with the Zoe, and they can fix it relatively cheaply. And there's going to be more of that. They're not going to have the monopoly on repairing EVs forever. People are going to realise that there's a real viable business there carrying out repairs of these things that the main dealers don't want to get involved in fixing. And that's no different than for petrol and diesel cars. There are various garages out there that will chuck in a reconditioned engine a lot cheaper than a main dealer will. And it's going to be the same for companies that are going to perform repairs to batteries where a module needs replacing, or they're going to recondition a charger unit, or whatever it is that needs to be fixed. The aftermarket repairers are going to be able to do that. And it will take a bit of time for that to gear up and the support mechanism to be formed. But there's no reason why it won't. And that will mean that EVs could be on the road for even longer. But that was it for this video. I went down this rabbit hole because someone was talking about not seeing very many older Teslas on the road. And I thought that was a good source of data to actually see whether or not the claims were correct. And as I said, there is no evidence that most EVs are more or less likely to be off the road earlier than anything else. And so I thought that was quite interesting and was worth sharing. But let me know what you think in the comments. How often do you see a 10-year-old plus Tesla Model 3, BMW i3, Nissan Leaf, etc. on the roads? And do you think it is more or less representative than other cars of that age? Bearing in mind, obviously, I mean, with the Ford Focus, they sold 8,900 of them in 2014. More than 10 times as many of any of the EVs we talked about here. So you will see them a bit more often just because they sold more of them in the first place. But that doesn't mean the EV models are thinning out or anything like that. But thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.